I've spent 9 months believing my wife Dorothy died because her heart gave out. Then one December night, during the worst snowstorm Lake Michigan had seen in years, I opened my front door for a tired old man and his tired old dog. My daughter told me not to. She nearly screamed it. But I let them in, and that dog walked past every room in this house and went straight to my daughter's door and wouldn't stop scratching. What I discovered behind that door changed everything. But the truth that broke me wasn't the crime itself. It was learning that my own daughter had been the weapon, and she never even knew it. Thank you for staying with me. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see how far these stories reach. Also, some elements in this story are fictional, added for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarities are unintentional, but the message may still carry meaning for those who listen. The overhead light in the kitchen had been broken for 4 weeks, and I hadn't bothered to fix it. That probably tells you everything you need to know about where I was at, mentally, that December. My name is Edwin Gallagher. Most people call me Ed. I'm 72 years old. Retired circuit court mediator. A man who spent 30 years listening to other people's problems, weighing their evidence, and helping them find resolutions that both sides could live with. Order wasn't just a professional requirement for me. It was the way I understood the world. Every dispute had a structure. Every conflict had a root cause. Every mess, no matter how tangled, could be sorted if you were patient enough to sit with it. But since March, I'd stopped sorting things. I'd stopped fixing things too, which is how the kitchen light had stayed dark for a month without anyone lifting a hand to change it. I sat at the table in that darkness most Friday evenings now, the way a man sits when he's run out of reasons to stand. Outside, the wind off Lake Michigan was doing what it does best in December, pushing inland with a particular kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. It gets inside the siding, inside the window frames, inside you. The farmhouse on County Road 37 had been full of sound when Dorothy was here. The radio she kept tuned to the oldies station while she cooked. The soft shuffle of her house slippers across the pine floors. The way she hummed something half-remembered while wiping down the countertops after dinner. Always the same circular motion. Always starting from the left side and working her way right. 9 months of silence had turned this place into something I barely recognized. The rooms felt wider somehow. Emptier, in a way that square footage couldn't explain. Her chair was still at the head of the table. I know I should have moved it. Victor, my son-in-law, had suggested it twice. Gently, the first time. Less gently, the second. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. That old oak chair with the cushion she'd recovered in green fabric back in 2011, it still held the shape of her somehow. Still faced the window where she liked to watch the cherry orchard in the morning while she drank her tea. Speaking of which, her mug was still on the shelf above the stove. The one with the hand-painted cherry blossoms on the side. A gift from the Traverse City Cherry Festival, the year we moved here. I hadn't touched it. I told myself it was because I didn't want to break it, but that wasn't the truth. And on quiet nights like this one, I wasn't in the habit of lying to myself. The truth was that moving things felt like erasing her. One object at a time. One shelf at a time, until the house forgot she'd ever been here at all. I reached for my own mug. Plain white, nothing special. Let the warmth seep into my palms. The tea had gone lukewarm. I drank it anyway. She'd tried to tell me something. That thought came back every night without fail. Always around this hour, when the house went fully quiet and there was nothing left to distract me from it. It was 2 days before she passed. She'd been in and out, some moments clear, others not. I was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, when her fingers tightened around mine with a strength I hadn't expected from a woman who could barely keep her eyes open. Her lips moved. She was trying to say something. I leaned in, but not close enough. I caught fragments. A word that might have been careful. something that sounded like a name, though I couldn't make it out. And then, the moment passed. She closed her eyes. The next time she woke, she didn't try again. I told myself she'd just been confused, that the medications had her mixing up dreams with reality. I told myself a lot of things that spring to get through the days. But in the dark of December, with the wind pressing against the kitchen windows and the cherry orchard standing bare and black against the gray sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd known something I didn't, that whatever she'd been trying to say wasn't confusion at all. I just hadn't leaned close enough to hear it. Down by the base of the refrigerator, tucked into the corner where it had sat for years, was the bowl. White ceramic, chipped along one edge, with a pale green ring painted around the rim. Dorothy had used it for Birch, the collie mix we'd had for 11 years before he passed, when Nora was still in pharmacy school. After Birch was gone, she'd kept the bowl. Couldn't bring herself to throw it out. Said it still had some use left in it. Victor had tried to get rid of it twice this fall. Both times I'd said no without fully understanding why. Maybe because it was one more thing that had been hers. Maybe because some part of me knew that when the last objects disappeared, something else would disappear with them. I left it where it was. I drank my cold tea and watched the first flakes of what the forecast was calling a significant lake effect event drift down past the back porch light, and I sat with the silence and the dark and the particular weight of a question I had not yet learned how to ask. Nora and Victor arrived around 7. I heard the tires on the gravel before I saw the headlights, the slow crunch of a vehicle taking the driveway carefully in the early snow. That sound used to mean something different. When Dorothy was alive, Friday evenings had a rhythm to them. The porch light on by 6:30. Something in the oven by 6:45. The table set with the good napkins because company was coming. Even if the company was just our daughter and her husband. Dorothy never treated family dinners as casual. She treated them as events worth preparing for. Now the porch light was off because I'd forgotten to turn it on, and the table had one plate on it because I'd already eaten a bowl of soup standing over the sink an hour earlier. Nora came through the front door first, the way she always did, with her coat already half off and her voice already filling the entryway. She was 41, dark hair cut just above the shoulders. Dorothy's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that always seemed to be holding something back even when the rest of her face was smiling. She'd been a pharmacist for 15 years, the kind who remembered her patients' names and asked about their grandchildren and caught dosage errors that the computers missed. She was good at what she did. That fact would come to matter more than I could have imagined. She hugged me the way she always did. Both arms, firm. Her chin on my shoulder for just a moment longer than a casual greeting required. She smelled like the vanilla hand lotion she'd been using since college. That part was real. Whatever else I would come to question about the months ahead, the way my daughter held me on Friday evenings was never one of them. Victor came in behind her. He was 45, tall, with the particular kind of confidence that fills a room without raising its voice. Dark blonde hair kept neat, a jaw that looked like it had been designed for boardrooms. He'd worked in insurance for nearly 20 years before stepping back to, as he put it, explore other opportunities. I'd never fully understood what those opportunities were. He spoke about them the way people speak about things they'd prefer you not to examine too closely, in general terms, with a smile that arrived at exactly the right moment. Dorothy had noticed it before I did. She noticed most things before I did. She'd said to me once, very quietly, in the kitchen after a holiday visit about 4 years ago, "There's something about that man, Ed. He knows too much about medications for someone who sells insurance." I'd told her she was being unfair. She hadn't argued. She'd just looked at me with those steady eyes of hers and gone back to drying the dishes. That was her way. She planted a thought and let it grow on its own schedule. Dinner was the usual arrangement. Food on the table, polite exchanges across it, long stretches where the only sound was silverware against ceramic. Victor asked how I was sleeping. I said fine. Nora mentioned something about the roads getting worse on Route 37. I nodded. We cleaned up without incident. It was choreography, more than conversation, each of us moving through our assigned positions with the practiced ease of people who had done this enough times to stop noticing what was missing. After dinner, Patrice set my evening medication on the counter. Patrice Dunlap. She was 48. Trim and composed, with dark hair cut practically short and the kind of efficient, unhurried movements that suggested a person who had arranged their life to eliminate unnecessary steps. She'd been coming to the house 5 days a week since September. When Victor had explained that given my health concerns, having some additional support around the house would be sensible. She managed my medications, kept track of my appointments with Dr. Whitfield, handled the grocery coordination, and generally ensured that the household ran with a smoothness it hadn't possessed since Dorothy was alive. She was good at her job, exceptionally good, in ways that I'd accepted as professionalism and hadn't examined further. Her smile was always in place when it needed to be, not the forced brightness of someone performing cheerfulness, but something more precise than that, a smile that arrived at exactly the right moment, calibrated to exactly the right degree. I swallowed the pills without looking at them closely. I hadn't looked closely in a long time. The small lineup of capsules in the weekly organizer had become a nightly ritual, and rituals, by their nature, stop requiring attention once they've become automatic. That was the danger of it, though I didn't know that yet. Later, when Victor and Nora had retreated to the guest room and Patrice had gone to her quarters at the far end of the hall, I sat alone in the living room and thought about September. Victor had come down one Sunday with a folder of documents. Financial power of attorney, he'd explained. Something to have in place given my health situation. Just a precaution. Completely standard for someone my age. He'd walked me through it the way you'd walk someone through a menu at a restaurant. Pointing at things. Explaining in general terms. Moving along before I had time to read the fine print. I'd signed. I'm not proud of that. A man who spent 30 years evaluating evidence, who could spot a procedural error in a court filing from across a conference table. I'd signed a legal document without reading it properly because my son-in-law had sat across from me with my daughter's hand resting on his arm and told me it was just a precaution, because I'd been tired, because it had only been 6 months since we'd buried her, and I hadn't had the energy to be suspicious of my own family. That was September. And sitting in the dark of December, with the memory of those signed papers in a drawer somewhere, I was beginning to understand that tired and careless are not the same thing, but they produce exactly the same results. I don't know what made me go downstairs that night. Not a sound exactly. The house was quiet, in the way old farmhouses are quiet after everyone has settled, which is to say not truly quiet at all. The furnace cycling on with its low, familiar thrum. The wind finding the gap beneath the back door that I'd been meaning to weather strip since October. The particular creak of the second-floor hallway boards that happened without any weight on them at all, just the wood adjusting itself to the cold the way wood does in a Michigan December. I hadn't slept. I'd been lying on my back in the dark for what felt like hours, watching the ceiling, and listening to the house breathe around me. The bedroom still smelled faintly of Dorothy's lavender sachets, the ones she'd tucked into the dresser drawers years ago and that had somehow retained their scent long past any reasonable expectation. I kept meaning to replace them. I kept not replacing them. Sometime after 11, I gave up on sleep entirely and made my way downstairs without turning on any lights. Out of habit. Maybe. Or maybe because the dark felt more honest than whatever the overhead bulbs would have shown me. An old man wandering his own house in the middle of the night, looking for something he couldn't name. I stood by the living room window for a while, watching the first serious flakes of what the forecast had been warning about for 2 days begin their descent under the streetlight at the end of the driveway. Lake-effect snow doesn't fall the way regular snow does. It doesn't drift or float. It comes sideways, in dense curtains, like the lake itself is trying to push inland and claim the town. People in Traverse City know this snow. We've spent our whole lives learning its moods, the way it can go from flurries to whiteout in 20 minutes, The way it buries fence posts and mailboxes and turns the cherry orchards into something that looks like a black and white photograph of a place that used to exist. Dorothy used to love it. She'd stand in this exact spot sometimes, both palms wrapped around her cherry blossom mug, just watching the yard disappear under white. She never needed to say anything on those nights. That was one of her gifts. The ability to be completely present without filling the air with words. She'd reach over sometimes and set her hand on my shoulder. Not a pat, not a squeeze, just her hand resting there, warm and steady and entirely sure of itself. I hadn't realized until she was gone that I'd been measuring my own calm against that hand for 38 years. Now the window just showed me my own reflection. An old man in a flannel shirt, hollow-eyed, holding a glass of water, like he'd forgotten what it was for. Then, for a reason I couldn't immediately explain, my eyes traveled upward, to the far corner of the room, the junction where the wall met the ceiling, half hidden behind the edge of the bookshelf. The camera was still there. I'd mounted it in 2016, after the Petersons down the road had a break-in. One of those small, unobtrusive units, barely bigger than a deck of cards. I'd set it up, tested it, connected it to a recording box I'd installed in the stable beside the water heater, and then somewhere in the chaos of the following years, simply forgotten about it. It had become part of the wall. Invisible, the way familiar things become invisible when you stop seeing them. Victor had told me he'd disconnected all the security cameras. Back in September, when he'd moved in, said he'd had someone come through and take care of it, that the old system was outdated, and he'd look into getting something modern installed eventually. I hadn't questioned it. I hadn't questioned much of anything in September, but this camera was on a separate circuit. I'd run the wiring myself, through the attic and down through the stable wall, completely independent of the main system. Whoever Victor had sent to disconnect things wouldn't have known it existed unless they'd crawled through every inch of the attic space and traced every wire to its source. The small blue indicator light on the front panel pulsed once, faintly. The slow rhythm of a system running on low power, still recording. After 8 years, I was still looking at it when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow and deliberate. I turned. Victor was standing at the bottom of the staircase, watching me. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, but his eyes were fully alert in the way that has nothing to do with having just woken up. "Dad." His voice was even, carefully even, in a way I'd grown used to without ever examining why. "You look exhausted. You should really get some rest." I looked at my son-in-law, his dark eyes steady, unreadable, holding mine for just a beat, longer than necessary. The particular quality of that gaze reminded me of something I'd seen many times in my years on the bench, the look of a person who is managing what you see. "You're right," I said. "I'll head up." I went upstairs. I lay down in the dark. I did not sleep. The strange thing about the past several months was how ordinary it had all looked from the outside. August had been the first time something felt off. I'd started waking up with a heaviness behind my eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. My hands trembled occasionally in the mornings, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed when I reached for my coffee. I'd gone to see Dr. Alan Whitfield, my family physician over on Munson Avenue, a steady and careful man I'd trusted for 12 years. He'd run some tests, reviewed my chart, and told me in his measured way that grief did unusual things to the body. Stress, too. He'd adjusted one of my prescriptions and told me to come back in 6 weeks. October had brought the stares. I still wasn't sure what to make of it. I'd been coming down to the kitchen in the morning, same as always, and somewhere between the 4th and 5th step, my foot had gone wrong. A slip. A lurch. That stomach-dropping instant of pure freefall. Victor had been right there, just behind me, and to my left, his hand shooting out to catch my shoulder. He'd steadied me. Of course he had, but I'd replayed that moment more times than I could count since then, and I couldn't say with certainty whether the pressure of his hand had been pulling me back, or for just a fraction of a second before it caught, something else. It was probably nothing. The kind of dark thought that grief plants in you when you're not watching. Still, I'd started holding the railing every time after that. The snow had been falling for over 2 hours by the time I gave up on sleep for the second time that night. I'd made my way back downstairs without turning on any lights, guided by the same restless gravity that had pulled me out of bed earlier. The storm had settled into something serious. I could hear it working against the eaves, that low, persistent pressure of wind finding every gap it could. Through the kitchen window, the back porch light showed the snow coming sideways in dense white sheets. The cherry orchard beyond it already disappearing into a wall of nothing. I stood at the kitchen window with a glass of water I wasn't drinking and let the storm do what storms do to a quiet house. It made the walls feel thinner. It made the warm air from the gas range feel more deliberate, more earned. And it made the silence inside feel louder by comparison, the way silence always does when the world outside is making noise and you're the only one listening. The knock came at 9:32 by the microwave clock. 3 sharp raps that cut straight through the sound of the wind. Not a timid knock. Not the uncertain tapping of someone hoping you might answer. 3 solid, intentional strikes, the kind made by a person who needed to be heard and had decided that politeness was less important than urgency. I set down my glass and went to the front door. The man standing on my porch was somewhere in his late 60s, maybe 70, lean and weathered in the way that comes from years of working outdoors. Not the gym-manufactured leanness of someone managing their appearance, but the real thing. The kind that gets carved into a person by decades of wind and water and work that doesn't care how old you are. His jacket was a dark canvas thing that had probably been waterproof once and wasn't anymore. Snow had collected on his shoulders, and across the brim of the wool cap he wore pulled low over his ears. His name, I'd learn in the next few minutes, was Clement Falk. Most people called him Clem. He was the kind of man you recognized even if you'd never met him. The sort of person who'd been knocked around by life plenty and had come through it, not bitter, but careful. He held his hands slightly out from his sides, palms open, the universal gesture of a man saying without words that he carried nothing and meant no harm. Beside him sat a doll, a Labrador retriever, old and large and broad-chested, with the patient, settled posture of an animal that had learned a long time ago how to wait. His coat was a deep gold, thick with melting snow, and he was watching me with the kind of steady, unhurried attention that most people never quite manage. Not anxious, not pleading, just looking at me the way you'd look at a door you'd been expecting to open. His name, I'd also learn shortly, was Hank. "Sir," Clem said, and his voice was rough from the cold. The way voices get when a person has been outside long enough for the air to work its way into the throat. "I'm real sorry to bother you this time of night. My truck went into a ditch about a quarter-mile back on County Road 37. Can't get it out till morning, and the storm's not letting up." He paused, looked down at the dog, then back at me. Hank doesn't do well left in the cold. His joints. I hadn't even gotten a word out before Nora appeared at my shoulder. "Dad." Her voice carried that particular register of forced calm that parents and children trade back and forth across a lifetime. The one that means the opposite of what it sounds like. "We don't know these people." She said it quietly but with an edge that was hard to miss. "It's the middle of the night in a snowstorm. We can call someone for them." I felt Victor before I saw him. He'd come up behind Nora without a sound, which was something he did with a regularity I'd only recently begun to notice. He didn't speak. He stood half a step behind my daughter, with his arms at his sides and his eyes fixed, not on Clem, not on me, but on the dog. Hank hadn't moved, hadn't shifted his weight or lowered his gaze or done any of the things a cold, tired animal might do when confronted with an open door and the promise of warmth behind it. He simply sat there on the snow-covered porch, his breath making small clouds in the frozen air, and watched me with those brown eyes that seemed to be in possession of more information than they were sharing. I looked at Clem. His jaw was tight, not from offense but from cold. His teeth were working to keep from chattering, and his hands, still held slightly out from his body, had the particular stillness of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether he spent the night in a warm kitchen or a frozen truck cab. I looked at Hank. The dog looked back. And something passed between us. In that exchange that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't recognition. Because I'd never seen this animal before in my life. It was more like an understanding. The kind that happens between two creatures who are both, in their own way, waiting to see what happens next. I pulled the door open wider. "Come in," I said. "Both of you." Clem let out a breath and nodded once. Deeply. The way men do when they're too proud to say thank you outright, but mean it completely. He stepped forward and Hank rose beside him, not stiffly, but with the careful, measured movement of an older animal who knows exactly how much his body will give him and doesn't waste any of it. As they crossed the threshold, I watched Victor. He wasn't watching Clem. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the dog, with an expression I hadn't seen on my son-in-law's face in the 6 years I'd known him. Not suspicion exactly. Not annoyance. Something quieter than either of those. Something that sat behind the eyes rather than on the surface of them. It looked almost like recognition. Like a man who had just seen something walk through his front door that he'd been hoping, for reasons he would never explain, would never show up. Hank's paws left wet prints on the hardwood as he walked past Victor without acknowledgement. The dog didn't look at him, didn't pause, didn't offer the usual courtesy that dogs extend to the people in a new space. He simply passed by as though Victor were a piece of furniture that held no interest, and continued down the hallway with the unhurried certainty of an animal that had been waiting for this particular door to open, and now that it had, knew exactly where he was going. By 10 o'clock, the kitchen had taken on that particular kind of warmth that only exists when the weather outside is genuinely trying to get at you. The old gas range was throwing heat the way it always had, steady and indifferent to anything happening beyond the walls. And the contrast with the storm made the air inside feel thicker somehow. More deliberate, like the house had decided. Just for tonight. To hold on to whatever warmth it could. Clem sat across from me at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. He'd declined the tea. Said he'd never developed a taste for it. Said it with the easy self-awareness of a man who knew exactly who he was and had stopped apologizing for it a long time ago. He'd shed his wet jacket and hung it on the back of the chair without being asked. The way a person does when they've been guests in enough homes to know the protocol without needing instruction. "Retired 5 years now," he said when I asked. "Spent most of my working life at the boatyards on West Bay. Built boats, repaired boats. Took apart boats that were past repairing. 40 years on the water, more or less." He said it without nostalgia or complaint. Just the plain recitation of a life that had been what it had been. After I retired, I found I needed something to do with the time. Started checking in on folks, older neighbors, people living alone, out on the county roads. Nothing official. Just something to keep the days from getting too long. I understood that better than I wanted to admit. "You live out this way?" I asked. "About 3 miles east. Old place off Route 12, right where the road bends before the cherry farms start. Nothing fancy." He smiled slightly. "Suits me fine." I refilled his coffee without asking. He let me, which told me he was comfortable. We sat with the sound of the storm for a moment. And it wasn't uncomfortable, which told me something about him. There are people who fill silence because they're afraid of it, and people who let it be because they understand it has its own purpose. Clem was the second kind. He mentioned his son briefly. The way you mention something when you've made a kind of peace with it but haven't forgotten its weight. "He's out in Phoenix now," he said. "Got a decent job, far as I can tell. We don't talk much." A pause. "Going on 5 years now. These things happen between fathers and children sometimes. Nobody's fault, really." He didn't elaborate and I didn't press. The tone he used wasn't self-pity. It was something quieter than that. The voice of a man who had sat with a hard thing long enough to stop fighting it. I thought about Nora upstairs. About the signed documents. About a hand on my shoulder on a staircase. I didn't say any of that. Hank had settled near the back door on the braided rug that Dorothy had picked out at a craft fair in Sutton's Bay years ago. He wasn't pacing, wasn't exploring. He simply lay with his broad chin resting on his front paws, amber brown eyes half open, as calm and unhurried, as if he'd been sleeping in this kitchen his whole life. Watching him, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Company. The uncomplicated kind. "What about Hank?" I asked after a while. Clem glanced at the dog. Hank's ear twitched, but he didn't lift his head. "Found him on County Road 12, Clem said. 3 winters back. Maybe 3.5. There'd been a research facility operating out past the county line. Federal contract work of some kind. I won't pretend I knew exactly what they were doing out there. They shut down, pulled out fast the way those operations sometimes do. And Hank was just there, standing on the shoulder of the road, like he was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back." He paused. "He was in good shape, well-fed, healthy, calm, clearly trained for something. I put out inquiries, checked around, never did find out who he belonged to or what he'd been trained to do exactly." He shook his head slowly. After a while, I stopped trying to figure it out and started just watching what he paid attention to. Turned out that was more useful than any answer I could have gotten. I looked at Hank. The dog looked back at me with those unhurried eyes. "He's not a regular dog," I said. Clem almost smiled. "No, he is not." It was then that Hank moved. Not with urgency, but with purpose. He rose from the rug in one smooth motion and walked to the corner beside the refrigerator, where the white ceramic bowl sat in its usual spot. Dorothy's bowl. Birch's bowl. The one with the chipped edge and the pale green ring that nobody had used for anything in years but that I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Hank approached it slowly. The last few steps almost careful. The way you approach something you recognize but want to confirm before committing to the recognition. He lowered his nose to the rim and held it there, not a quick sniff. A long, still, concentrated investigation. The kind that isn't about curiosity, but about certainty. His whole body quieted in a way I hadn't seen since he'd come through the front door. Even his breathing seemed to change. Then, with a slowness that felt almost deliberate, he folded himself down onto the floor beside the bowl. His broad chin came to rest on the tiles, his muzzle inches from the porcelain rim. He didn't close his eyes. He just lay there alongside it in the manner of an animal observing a period of stillness that meant something I didn't have the language for. Clem had come to the kitchen doorway. When I looked at him, his expression was one I hadn't seen on him yet. Not quite sad, but weighted. Careful in a different way than usual. "That bowl," he said, quietly enough that it didn't carry past the two of us. It meant something to someone he knew. I looked at the bowl. Chipped rim. Faded green ring. Sitting in the same corner where Dorothy had always kept it. I didn't ask Clem to explain further. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the explanation. Then Hank rose. No particular signal that I could identify. He simply stood, smoothly and without hurry, and turned toward the hallway. The hallway that ran along the back of the house, past the laundry room, past the coat closet, ending at the door of the room that had once been Nora's childhood bedroom and was now used by Victor as a home office. A room that had been closed since before dinner. A room I had not been inside since sometime in October, when I'd gone in looking for a stapler and Victor had appeared in the doorway almost immediately, asking if I needed help finding something. Hank walked to that door without stopping, without hesitating, without any of the tentative investigation he might have given another closed room in a strange house. He stopped 6 inches from the wood. The sound he made was not the frantic barking of an anxious animal. It was short, even, deliberate. 3 measured alerts. Each one identical. Each one landing in the quiet hallway like a statement, rather than a reaction. Then he raised one paw and dragged it down the door. Once, twice, 3 times. precise and unhurried. The silence afterward felt louder than the barking had. Clem crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and crouched beside Hank, one hand resting on the dog's back. He looked up at me, and his voice was very steady. "In 7 years," he said, "he has never done this without a reason." The hallway held the silence the way a courtroom holds it after a verdict has been read. Not empty, charged, full of something that hadn't been said yet, but was already in the room. Clem stayed crouched beside Hank, one hand flat on the dog's back. He looked up at me, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who has weighed what he's about to say and decided the moment requires it. "I should have told you this earlier," he said. "The facility where I found him. They were doing detection work. Chemical compounds. Substances that don't belong in a residential environment." He kept his eyes on mine. Hank was trained to identify those compounds. Harmful ones. The kind that accumulate slowly. The kind that don't announce themselves. A pause. The wind pressed against the hallway window. In the 3 years I've had him, he's alerted on 4 separate occasions. Every single time, there was a reason. Every single time, what he found was exactly what shouldn't have been there. I stood in the hallway and looked at the closed door. And in the space between one breath and the next, my mind did something it had been carefully avoiding for 9 months. It connected things. The heaviness behind my eyes since August. The trembling in my hands that Dr. Whitfield had attributed to grief. The pills in the weekly organizer that Patrice arranged with such meticulous care. The way the capsules had looked different, slightly, just slightly, from the ones I'd been taking the year before. The way Nora had adjusted my dosages with the focused, professional attention of a woman who believed completely that she was helping her father. The way Victor had supervised that process from behind, suggesting, guiding, always with a reason that sounded medical enough to go unquestioned. And Dorothy, who had not been sick in the way that sick is supposed to look, who had been here one morning, cooking breakfast with the radio on low, and then by degrees, and then all at once, she hadn't been, who had tried to say something to me from her bed with a grip I still felt in my hand on quiet nights, who had looked at me with eyes I'd told myself were confused by medication. What if they hadn't been confused at all? What if she'd been trying to warn me? I was still standing there when the light at the far end of the hallway came on. Victor stood at the top of the basement stairs, t-shirt and sweatpants, hair undisturbed, eyes fully alert in the way that had nothing to do with being woken by noise. "Ed." His voice was flat. No warmth in it at all now. Not even the performance of warmth. "Get that animal away from my office door. Right now. Not please. Not what's going on. Just the instruction. Delivered with the authority of a man who is not accustomed to repeating himself." I looked at my son-in-law standing in the hallway of the house I'd built. The house where Dorothy had planted cherry trees, and tried at the end to tell me something I hadn't leaned close enough to hear. For the first time in 6 years, standing in my own hallway at nearly midnight with a trained detection animal pressing its nose against his locked office door, I was not sure I knew him at all. Hank didn't move. His eyes stayed on the door, absolute and unwavering. "Clem," I said quietly, "I think it's best if we all get some rest." Clem stood. He looked at me, then at Victor, then back at me. He didn't say anything, but his expression told me he'd understood everything that had happened in this hallway and everything that hadn't been said. He called Hank with a low whistle. The dog rose reluctantly, casting one final look at the closed door before following Clem back toward the kitchen. As they passed Victor, Hank's gaze shifted briefly to my son-in-law, a look that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Quiet, complete, utterly without deference. Victor watched them go. "We'll talk about this in the morning," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. He went back upstairs. The door closed, with a sound that was soft enough to be deliberate. I didn't sleep that night either. By 6 the following morning, the storm had passed. The world outside the kitchen window was a study in stillness, every surface buried under 8 maybe 10 inches of new snow, the fence posts wearing their white caps, the bare cherry trees holding their branches out against a sky that had gone from iron to the pale, thin blue that sometimes follows a heavy snowfall in northern Michigan. The kind of morning that would have made Dorothy reach for her camera. Clem came downstairs just after 6 with Hank at his heels. "Roads should be passable by 7:30, he said, checking the window. "Stay for breakfast," I said. "Both of you." He didn't argue. I made eggs. He ate without complaint. Hank accepted a piece of toast with the grave dignity of an animal doing you a small favor. We didn't talk about the hallway. The events of the previous night sat between us on the kitchen table like a document that both parties have read and neither is ready to sign. When Clem stood to leave, he zipped his jacket and set a scrap of paper on the counter beside the coffee maker. "My number," he said. He looked at me directly. "If you need anything, Mr. Gallagher." A pause. "Anything at all." The way he said it, the slight repetition, the steadiness in his eyes, made it clear he wasn't talking about a stuck truck or a borrowed cup of sugar. He meant something that covered a wider range of circumstances than neighborly assistance. I folded the paper and put it in my shirt pocket. He nodded once. I watched from the front window as his truck made its way down County Road 37 and disappeared around the curve past the cherry orchards. Hank was a golden shape in the passenger seat, watching the road ahead. The house felt quieter after they left. A different kind of quiet than the usual kind. Not emptier, just more aware of itself. At exactly 8 o'clock, the front door opened. Patrice came in with the cold still on her coat, and her smile already in position. "Morning, Mr. Gallagher." Roads were something this morning. She was already moving toward the kitchen, already reaching for the cabinet where the mugs were kept. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," I said. The way I always said fine. She set about her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had every inch of this house committed to memory. And I stood by the window, watching the place where Clem's truck had been, and began for the first time in 9 months to pay a different kind of attention to the people around me. I spent the rest of that day doing something I hadn't done since my years on the bench. I watched without letting on that I was watching. Clem's visit and what Hank had done in the hallway had settled into me the way cold does when you've been outside too long. Gradually, completely, until you stop noticing the sensation and start noticing only what it's changed. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I wasn't ready to do much of anything, except pay attention in a way I hadn't been paying attention before. Patrice moved through the house with her usual seamless efficiency, and I moved through it alongside her. Neither of us gave any indication that the morning had been anything other than ordinary. But I watched. I watched her glance at her phone when she thought I was focused on my book. The quick, practiced check of someone expecting updates. I watched her position herself near the doorway of whichever room I was making calls from. Her movements always having some plausible domestic explanation, straightening a shelf, adjusting a thermostat, that put her within reasonable earshot. I watched the way she asked twice in one afternoon whether I was planning to go out, the question phrased as consideration, landing as something else entirely. She was thorough. I'd give her that. And she'd been thorough, I now understood. For every one of the 3 months she'd been inside this house. Victor came down for breakfast around 8:30. He poured himself coffee, exchanged a few words with Patrice about the weekend road conditions. At one point she said something low that I didn't catch from my position at the table. Victor's eyes moved briefly to me, then back to her, and he gave a small nod. Not an unusual nod. The kind two people give each other when they share an understanding that doesn't require full sentences. I looked down at my newspaper. I didn't read a word of it. Patrice stepped out of the kitchen to make a call around 9. And while she was in the hallway, I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked at my pills, not the casual glance of a man confirming he'd taken the right number. A real look. The weekly organizer sat on the counter where it always sat. Today's compartment already open. I picked up the 2 capsules designated for morning and held them in my palm under the kitchen light. My blood pressure medication. I'd been taking it for 5 years. I knew what it looked like. White, round, about the size of an aspirin. The capsule in my hand was off-white, slightly yellowish in the way of something that had been substituted rather than aged. And the shape was wrong. Not round but gently oval, the kind of difference that's easy to miss when you're not looking and impossible to unsee once you are. I set them back in the organizer. I didn't know what to do with that observation yet, so I filed it away in the same place I'd been filing things for months, that quiet ledger at the back of my mind where I kept the items I wasn't ready to act on. A judge learns early that reacting before you have the full picture is the fastest way to arrive at the wrong conclusion. It was on my way back from the laundry room that I saw her. The door to the hallway bathroom, the one with the built-in medicine cabinet, was open. Patrice stood in front of it, facing the shelves. She wasn't taking anything out. She wasn't putting anything back. She was running her fingers lightly along the tops of the prescription bottles, one after another, in the methodical way of someone counting inventory they've memorized and are verifying. I stopped in the doorway. She turned. Not startled, not flustered, with the same even composure that seemed to operate independently of circumstances. Just making sure everything's accounted for, Mr. Gallagher. Her smile arrived on schedule. I like to stay on top of these things. Of course, I said. I went back to the kitchen. Behind me, I heard the soft click of the cabinet closing. Then, a few seconds later, the faint, deliberate sound of fingers moving across a phone screen. That afternoon, while Victor was in town with Nora and Patrice was upstairs running the vacuum, I put on my coat and walked out the back door toward the stable. The stable sat at the edge of the property, about 60 yards from the house. A long, low building that had once held 2 horses and now held the accumulated evidence of 40 years of living in one place. My woodworking tools along the far wall, paint cans on metal shelving. A workbench I'd built myself the year we moved in, still solid after 3 decades of use. The air inside smelled of old oak and machine oil, and the particular dusty warmth of a space that hasn't been properly ventilated in months. Victor never came out here. He'd mentioned once, early on, that the sawdust and wood oils bothered his sinuses. Whether that was true or simply convenient, the result was the same. The stable was mine, the last space in this house, or near it, that belonged entirely to me. Dorothy had known that. I knew this because of what I found behind the 3rd shelf on the workbench wall, wedged between a box of wood screws and an old can of polyurethane. Her laptop, the small silver one she'd used for emails and recipe searches and the occasional video call with Helen Richter, her closest friend. It had been missing since the summer. I'd assumed it had been packed away somewhere during the cleanup after she passed. Another object absorbed into the general disorder of grief. It hadn't been packed away. It had been hidden. Deliberately, in the one place in this house where Victor would never think to look. The battery was dead. I found the charger in the bottom drawer of the workbench, coiled neatly the way Dorothy coiled things, and plugged it in. The screen came to life after a minute. Her desktop wallpaper was a photograph of the cherry orchard in full bloom, taken from the kitchen window. I opened her email. The message was dated 11 days before she died. Sent to Helen Richter at 7:14 in the morning, the hour Dorothy always woke. Helen, the new medication Victor suggested feels wrong. I don't feel like myself anymore. My hands shake and my thoughts get cloudy in the afternoons, and I can't remember if I've eaten. Please keep this. Just in case. I don't want to worry Ed until I'm sure. But something isn't right. I can feel it. I sat on the workbench with the laptop balanced on my knees, surrounded by the smell of old wood and machine oil, and I read those sentences again and again. The stable was quiet. Through the small window above the shelf, I could see the back of the house, the kitchen window, where Dorothy used to stand. She'd known something was wrong. She'd known it 11 days before the end. And she'd hidden the evidence in the only place in this entire property that belonged to no one but me. The knock came early the following morning, before Patrice was due. not the solid, deliberate knock Clem had used. This one was softer, almost apologetic. The knock of a person who has been standing on the other side of the door for a while, working up the courage to make contact. Helen Richter was standing on the front porch with her wool hat held in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim. She was 75, with a face that had always reminded me of someone who had spent her career taking care of people and had never quite figured out how to stop. She and Dorothy had been friends for 30 years. They'd met at the Cherry Festival the summer we moved to Traverse City. And from that afternoon onward, they'd been the kind of close that doesn't require constant contact to maintain. The kind where you can go 2 weeks without speaking and pick up exactly where you left off. She looked, standing there in the cold morning light, like a woman who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. "Ed," she said. "You got a few minutes? I made a fresh pot." We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and for a while neither of us said anything. That was all right. We were old enough to know that some conversations need a moment to find their footing. Helen wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the table surface. The kitchen clock marked the seconds. Outside, a crow landed on the back fence, surveyed the yard with that sharp avian authority, and left. "I've been trying to come over here since July," she said finally. "Every week I'd tell myself today was the day, and then I'd—" She stopped, set down her mug. I kept thinking maybe I was wrong about what she told me, that she was confused, that the medications were making her see things that weren't there. She looked up at me. "But I wasn't wrong, Ed. I've known that. The whole time." I waited. Dorothy had called her 10 days before she passed. Early morning, the hour she always woke. Helen said Dorothy's voice had been clear but frightened, the particular kind of frightened that belongs to someone who has arrived at a conclusion they desperately wish they hadn't reached. She said Victor had been changing her medications, Helen told me. Not directly. Through Nora. He'd suggest adjustments. Tell Nora the doctor had approved them. And Nora would make the changes because she trusted her husband and because she's a pharmacist and the dosages made sense on paper. Helen's hands were trembling slightly around the mug. Dorothy said she felt like she was disappearing. Those were her exact words. "I feel like I'm disappearing, Helen, and I don't think it's the illness doing it." She paused, took a breath that cost her something. "I also saw that woman, Patrice, 3, maybe 4 times in August and September, late at night, walking between the house and the stable." She shook her head. "My bedroom faces your property, Ed. I couldn't sleep most nights after Dorothy passed. I'd stand at the window and just look out at nothing." Her voice dropped. "What kind of home health aide needs to visit a horse stable at midnight?" I didn't answer that. The answer was forming itself in a place beyond words. Helen reached into her coat pocket and produced a white envelope, slightly creased, sealed with a piece of tape that had yellowed with age. My name was written across the front in Dorothy's handwriting. I would know it anywhere. The particular slant of her letters, the way she formed her capital E. "She gave me this in August," Helen said. "Asked me to hold on to it. Said I'd know when the time was right to bring it over." Her eyes were wet now. The kind of wet that belongs to a person who doesn't cry easily and is losing that fight. "I think the time is right, Ed." I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 items. A printed copy of the same email I'd found on Dorothy's laptop, the one she'd sent Helen 11 days before the end, and beneath it a single sheet of paper, folded twice, covered in Dorothy's handwriting. The letters were larger than usual, pressed harder into the paper, the way someone writes when they're concentrating hard on the physical act of forming words because the body is no longer cooperating the way it should. I read what she'd written. "Ed, if something happens to me, look in the stable. And tell Nora it wasn't her fault. She just loved the wrong man." The kitchen was very quiet. I read those 2 sentences again. Then a third time. I placed both hands flat on the table, palms down, the way I used to do at my desk when testimony wasn't adding up and I needed to keep myself from reacting before I understood the full picture. The surface was cold under my hands. I focused on that. The specific physical fact of cold wood under my palms. While everything else tried to rise. She wasn't thinking about herself, Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every time we talked, every phone call in those last weeks, she was thinking about you. What would happen to you? Whether you'd be all right. A pause. And about Nora. She kept saying Nora didn't know. That Nora couldn't have known. I didn't speak. I folded the papers carefully and placed them in the pocket of my flannel shirt, close against my chest. I walked Helen to the door. She put her hat back on with the slow, careful movements of a person who had set down something heavy and wasn't sure whether she felt better or worse for it. She went down the front steps and across the yard, leaving dark impressions in the snow. I turned back into the house. Patrice was standing at the top of the staircase. She had one hand resting on the banister, her body angled slightly toward the lower landing, looking down at me with that composed expression that never quite shifted into anything you could name. She'd arrived at some point while Helen and I were talking. I hadn't heard the door. "Oh, Mr. Gallagher." Her voice was its usual even temperature. "Is everything all right?" I heard voices. I looked up at her. Considered the angle of where she was standing. Considered how much of a kitchen conversation would carry up an open staircase in a house this quiet. Considered the phone she was never without. "Everything's fine," I said. "Thank you, Patrice." She nodded and moved back down the hallway with her customary efficiency. I stayed at the bottom of the stairs a moment longer, looking up at the empty landing, and thought about how long she'd been standing there before she decided to let me know she was there at all. I spent the rest of that day watching and being watched. I could feel it now. The particular quality of attention that exists in a house where more than one person is keeping track of more than one thing. Patrice moved through her routines with her usual efficiency, but something had shifted in the calibration. She checked her phone more frequently. She found reasons to pass by whichever room I was in at closer intervals. Twice she paused outside the bedroom door while I was inside, her footsteps stopping for 3 or 4 seconds before continuing down the hall. She was reporting. I was certain of it now. Whatever she'd heard from the staircase that morning had been enough to change the frequency. That evening, after Victor and Nora had gone upstairs and Patrice had retired to her room at the far end of the hall, I went to the bedroom. Our bedroom. Dorothy's. And mine. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the middle drawer of the small writing desk in the corner. The one that had been Dorothy's domain for 30 years. I'd left the contents deliberately undisturbed since finding her laptop in the stable. The same old receipts. A birthday card I'd given her sometime in the 90s. A small leather address book she'd stopped using years ago. A handful of photographs that hadn't made it to the wall. Everything in the same arrangement I'd memorized without meaning to, the way a judge memorizes the layout of documents on a desk through sheer repetition. The birthday card I'd left face down was face up. The address book had been moved 2 inches to the left and set back with the spine facing the wrong direction. Someone had been through it. Carefully, but not carefully enough. They'd been looking for Dorothy's note. The one Helen had given me that morning. The one that was now in my shirt pocket, pressed against my ribs, where it had been all day. Carol didn't know I'd already moved it. She'd been searching for something that wasn't there anymore. I straightened the birthday card, closed the drawer. Then I waited. The house settled into silence by 11. I gave it another 2 hours after that, lying on my back in the dark, listening. Victor and Nora's light had gone out by 10. Patrice's room at the end of the hall had been quiet since 9:30. At just past 1 in the morning, I went downstairs in my socks and took the back door slowly, easing it open an inch at a time, the way you handle a door when you've lived in a house long enough to know which hinge protests. The cold hit me immediately. December air in northern Michigan at 1 in the morning is not something that invites contemplation. It demands movement. I crossed the 60 yards to the stable in under a minute. The snow crunching under my feet in the particular way it does when the temperature has dropped well below freezing. The recording unit was where I'd left it in 2016. A gray metal box mounted to the wall beside the water heater, behind the shelving unit of paint cans and old tools. The indicator light on the front panel pulsed blue and steady, the slow rhythm of a system that had been running on low power for 8 years without anyone knowing or caring that it existed. I found a USB drive in the drawer of the workbench, plugged it in, pulled the 3 most recent weeks of footage. Back upstairs, bedroom door locked. I opened the files on Dorothy's laptop, with the screen brightness turned low. Most of it was nothing. The stable interior, empty and unchanging. Occasional movement when a raccoon or a cat triggered the motion sensor. I moved through it in fast increments, watching the timestamp climb. 21 days back. I stopped. 2:15 in the morning. The stable interior, lit by the single overhead bulb that was connected to the motion detector. Victor and Patrice, standing close together near the workbench. Not the distance of employer and employee. The distance of 2 people who had long since stopped maintaining professional boundaries. His hand was on her arm. Her body was angled toward his, with the particular ease of familiarity. I turned up the volume, Victor's voice first, low and unhurried. The tone of someone discussing logistics. She's doing exactly what I tell her with the medications. She thinks she's helping him. She adjusts the dosage every week like clockwork because I tell her Whitfield approved it and she trusts me. A brief pause. Another month, and he won't be able to sign his own name. The cognitive decline will be obvious enough that no one questions anything. Patrice's voice. Even practical. The voice of a woman confirming details she already knew. And the paperwork? Almost done. Just need the last signature on the trust amendment. After that, it doesn't matter what he says or who he talks to. A silence. Then Patrice, quieter now, with something that might have been the edge of a smile in her voice. Just like the last one. That I'm by K. Victor didn't respond to that. He pulled her closer, and they stood there for a moment in the dim light of my stable, 2 people who were not what they had presented themselves to be, comfortable in each other's company, in the way that only comes from years of shared purpose. I sat back from the screen. The USB drive was warm from the laptop port. I closed my fingers around it, just like the last one. 4 words. Ordinary words in any other context. In this one, they confirmed what Hank had already told me, with 3 barks and a scratched door. This was not the first time. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. The message was short. Stop asking questions, Ed. Come home and be quiet. 7 words. I read them once, then again. They knew. Through Patrice, through whatever network of surveillance they'd built around me, they knew I'd been looking. And they were telling me they knew, which meant they'd decided that telling me was more effective than waiting, which meant they were accelerating. I set the phone down. The house was silent around me. Then I heard it. Footsteps, just outside the bedroom door. Unhurried. They stopped directly outside. The silence lasted 5 seconds. 6. Then they moved away, back down the hall, and a door closed softly somewhere in the distance. I sat in the dark and held the USB drive against my palm and thought about my daughter. My Nora, who woke up every morning in this house and measured out capsules with the careful precision of a woman who had spent 15 years making sure medications were right, who adjusted dosages because her husband told her the doctor had approved it, who believed, with every fiber of her professional training and every ounce of her love for me, that she was keeping her father alive, and who had been, every single morning for 3 months, handing me the thing that was designed to take me apart. I left the house at 7:30 the following morning. I told no one where I was going. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said 1 word. Errands. The same word I'd use again in the days ahead, a single syllable that covered everything and revealed nothing. The drive into town took 12 minutes. The roads were clear enough, the plows having done their work before dawn, and the morning light over Grand Traverse Bay had that pale, thin quality that December produces when the clouds pull apart just enough to remind you the sun still exists. I drove with the USB drive in my coat pocket and Dorothy's papers in my shirt pocket, and the weight of both pressing against me from opposite sides like two halves of an argument I hadn't finished having with myself. Martin Crane's office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Front Street that had housed one professional practice or another since before I could remember. The waiting room smelled of old paper and strong coffee, the specific combination that belongs to offices where serious work has been done for a long time. His assistant, a steady woman named Ruth who had been with him for 18 years, showed me in without small talk. Crane was already standing when I entered, which he didn't usually do. He was 60, trim, deliberate, with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had spent decades being the person other people called when things went wrong. He'd handled our wills, managed a property line dispute in 2009, and taken care of Dorothy's estate paperwork after she passed. 25 years of trust built one document at a time. He shook my hand and gestured to the chair across his desk. I sat down and placed the USB drive between us without preamble. "There's footage on that," I said. 21 days back. The stable. You'll want to hear what's on it." He nodded. Set it aside with the careful precision of a man who understands chain of custody. Then he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me. "I need to tell you something first," he said. He'd discovered the discrepancy in August, 10 weeks after Dorothy passed. A routine review of the estate documents, the kind of procedural check he performed as a matter of practice, had surfaced an inconsistency in the signature on the primary will. He'd pulled the original from his own files, the document Dorothy had signed in his presence 12 years ago, and compared it against the version that had been submitted for probate. The forgery was skilled. Whoever had done it understood the general character of Dorothy's handwriting, the slight leftward lean, the way she connected certain letters. But Crane had watched Dorothy sign her name across 25 years of documents. He knew the particular pressure she applied at the start of a capital D, the way her G's widened slightly at the base. The version in the submitted document didn't have those things. It had the impression of them without the substance. "I've been waiting," Crane said, "for you to come to me. I didn't want to approach you directly without more to work with. I needed to know you were in a position to act on it. I thought about the months I'd spent telling myself I was imagining things. You should have called me," I said. "Yes," he said simply. "I should have." He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and produced a white envelope, aged to the color of old ivory, sealed and unmarked except for my name written in Dorothy's hand across the front. I looked at it for a moment before I touched it. "She came to see me," Crane said. "1 week before she passed. She said she needed to update certain arrangements, and that I should hold on to this." He paused. "She said to give it to you only if you were in danger." Her words exactly. Dorothy had come to this office 7 days before she died. She had sat in this same chair, across from this same desk, and she had done what needed to be done. Not in panic, not in confusion, but with the deliberate thoroughness of a woman who understood that she was running out of time and intended to use what remained of it properly. The updated will was the first thing Crane showed me. The real one. The one Dorothy had prepared without Victor's knowledge, leaving the entirety of her personal estate to the Traverse City Cherry Festival Foundation. Not to Nora, not to Victor, not to me. To the organization she'd supported quietly for 20 years, the way Dorothy supported most things, without announcement or expectation of recognition. "There's more," Crane said. He set a second document on the desk. Dorothy's life insurance policy. $750,000. The original beneficiary was the Cherry Festival Foundation. It was changed 16 months ago. He paused. Victor is currently the sole beneficiary. The signature on the change of beneficiary form is Dorothy's, or something intended to look like it. I had my hand on the back of the chair. "I kept it there." "She didn't sign that," I said. It wasn't a question. Crane shook his head once. I stood there with my hand on the chair and looked at the far wall of his office. A framed photograph of Grand Traverse Bay, the water and sky and shoreline of a place I'd lived my whole adult life. And I thought about a man who had sat at my kitchen table for 6 years, who had walked my daughter down no aisle because they'd eloped, who had poured me coffee on Sunday mornings and driven me to doctor's appointments and looked me in the eye while he did all of it, and who had at some point taken his wife's mother's signature and practiced until he could replicate it well enough to redirect $750,000. Crane picked up the ivory envelope. "Take this home," he said quietly. "Read it when you're alone." I took the envelope. It was lighter than I expected. The kind of light that has nothing to do with weight and everything to do with what's inside. I placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket, where the USB drive had been, and felt it settle against my ribs like something with a pulse. Dr. Alan Whitfield's practice occupied the ground floor of a converted brick building on Munson Avenue, the kind of neighborhood where a family physician could still run an independent office without being absorbed by a hospital network. That was part of why I'd stayed with him for 12 years. He was 54, careful in the particular way of men who had learned caution through experience rather than temperament, and he had always struck me as genuinely interested in his patients rather than merely responsible for them. I'd called ahead from the car outside Crane's office. He was waiting at the door when I arrived, which told me everything about the state of his conscience. A doctor who meets you at the door before office hours is not a doctor who has been sleeping well. He locked the door behind me, crossed to the window and drew the blinds. Not quickly, deliberately. The way a person moves when they've decided to do something they've been avoiding and want to do it properly now that they've started. He didn't offer coffee. He sat down across from me and set a manila folder on the desk between us and put both hands flat on top of it. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "I've known that for a while." He'd flagged the anomaly in October, the first time my blood work had come back with indicators that didn't align with grief and age-related stress, which had been his working explanation for my symptoms since the summer. A persistent suppression of cholinesterase enzyme activity showing up across 3 separate draws over 6 weeks. Low level. Consistent. The kind of pattern that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but builds a picture over time for anyone paying attention. The picture it built was not a comfortable one. The dizziness. The fatigue. That sleep didn't resolve. The occasional difficulty finding words mid-sentence, which I'd been attributing to age and hadn't mentioned to anyone. All of it fit the profile of long-term, low-dose exposure to a compound that interfered with the nervous system's basic chemistry. "I prepared a report," Whitfield said. "I was going to call you in, go over the results, recommend a specialist, and a formal investigation into the source." He stopped, looked at his hands. "Then Victor came to see me before I could make that call. He described it the way I imagined it had happened. Quietly. Without theater. Victor hadn't threatened him overtly. He'd arrived at the office, waited until the last patient was gone, and sat down in the chair across from Whitfield's desk. He'd mentioned, in the course of what he framed as a concerned son-in-law's inquiry about his father-in-law's health, that he'd come across some information about a period several years back when Whitfield's prescription records had contained certain irregularities, nothing that had been formally investigated, nothing that had gone anywhere, nothing that couldn't, if it surfaced now, cost a 54-year-old doctor everything he'd spent his career building. He didn't say do this or don't do that, Whitfield said. He didn't have to. The message was clear enough. A pause. "I told myself you were stable, that the levels weren't acutely dangerous, that I'd act when there was a more obvious reason to act." He looked up. I kept waiting for that reason to arrive, without requiring anything difficult from me. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the traffic on Munson Avenue through the closed blinds. "It required something difficult from my wife instead," I said. Whitfield didn't answer that. He opened the folder and slid it across the desk. The records were thorough. 6 months of blood work, annotated in his careful hand, with the relevant values circled and compared against baseline. I looked through them with the steady, deliberate attention I used to give court documents that required full understanding before I responded. Then I reached the last page. It was a separate report. A supplemental analysis, dated 2 months after Dorothy had passed, conducted on a preserved blood sample from the night she was admitted to Munson Medical Center. I read the summary line twice. Elevated concentration of a cardiotoxic compound consistent with extended exposure over a period of weeks. Not heart failure. Something designed to produce the symptoms of heart failure while the actual cause accumulated silently underneath. I ran it on my own, Whitfield said quietly. I didn't submit it anywhere. I was. He stopped. Started again. I was afraid of what submitting it would set in motion. I set the page down. If she had come to me, Whitfield said, and his voice had changed, lost the careful, managed quality it had carried through the rest of the conversation. If she'd come in even a week earlier, Ed, I would have seen it. I could have. Don't, I said. Not harshly. I just didn't have room for his guilt on top of everything else I was carrying. He nodded, opened the folder again and pointed to the last column on the final page. The compound in your blood work, he said. The one suppressing the cholinesterase activity. He looked at me. It's the same family of substances, Ed. Adapted slightly, different delivery method, but the same underlying methodology. Whoever did this to Dorothy refined the approach and brought it here. To you. I took the folder. Thanked him. Stood up. The snow on Munson Avenue was light and purposeless, the kind that drifts down without accumulating, just enough to settle on your shoulders and melt before you've walked a block. I stood outside Whitfield's building and let my eyes adjust to the flat winter light. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message was 9 words long. We know you've been talking to people, Ed. Stop. I read it once. Then again. They knew. Through Patrice. Through someone watching. Through whatever architecture of attention they'd constructed around me. They knew I was moving, and they were telling me again, which meant the first warning hadn't produced the desired result. Which meant the next step wouldn't be a warning at all. I put the phone in my coat pocket and stood on the sidewalk with the folder of medical records under my arm and the envelope from Crane against my ribs and the snow coming down on my shoulders. And I thought about a woman who had figured out what was happening to her, who had gone to her attorney and written a letter and hidden a laptop in a stable and tried to tell me something from her bed that I hadn't been close enough to hear. She had done everything she could with the time she had. She had not had enough time. I was not going to make the same mistake. I started walking. The folder from Dr. Whitfield sat on the passenger seat the entire drive home. It was heavier than paper and ink should have been. I kept my right hand on the steering wheel and my left hand on top of it, as though the wind might carry it away if I let go. I did not go inside when I pulled into the driveway. Instead, I sat in the car with the engine running, heat pushing through the vents, and I looked at the house I had lived in for 31 years. The porch light was off again. It had been off more often than on since Dorothy died. Inside that house, my daughter was probably preparing my evening medication in the small plastic organizer she kept beside the kitchen sink. She would count the capsules the way she counted inventory at the pharmacy, methodical, precise, trusting the labels because that was what she had been trained to do. She would not question what was inside them because Victor had assured her, months ago, that the adjusted dosage came from Dr. Whitfield himself. She believed her husband. She believed she was keeping her father alive. I turned the engine off and sat in the silence. At 4:17 that afternoon, I called the number Martin Crane had written on the back of his business card. It was not his office line. It belonged to Detective Lieutenant Renee Castillo of the Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Department, Major Crimes Unit. Crane told me she was the only person in the county he would trust with this. And when I heard her voice on the phone, low, unhurried, direct, I understood why. I told her everything. I started with Dorothy's death in March and finished with the anonymous text I had received 13 hours earlier. She did not interrupt me once. When I was done, there was a pause long enough for me to hear the scratch of a pen on paper, and then she said, "Mr. Gallagher, can you meet me tomorrow morning?" Not at the station. Somewhere quiet. We agreed on the municipal library on Woodmere Avenue. Second floor. The reading room that overlooked the bay. I had mediated 17 civil disputes in that room during my years on the bench. It seemed fitting that the 18th would be about my own family. She was already seated when I arrived at 9 the next morning. Renee Castillo was perhaps 50. Compact build. Dark hair pulled tight. No jewelry, except a plain watch. She wore a navy blazer over a gray sweater, and the only indication that she carried authority was the leather credential case she placed on the table between us, like a period at the end of a sentence. I handed her the USB drive, the medical folder, the photocopies Crane had prepared of both wills and the insurance amendment, and the creased envelope containing Dorothy's note and email. She examined each item without speaking, turning pages with the tip of a pen rather than her fingers. When she reached the printed transcript I had made of Victor and Patrice's stable conversation, she read it twice. Then she opened a manila folder of her own. 3 years ago, she said, a woman named Elaine Brecker died in Cadillac, about an hour south of here. 68 years old. Retired schoolteacher. Her death was attributed to cardiac arrhythmia compounded by a pre-existing thyroid condition. Her son-in-law managed her finances and had recently been added as the primary beneficiary on her life insurance policy. The son-in-law's name was Victor Hale. I heard the words. I understood them. But for several seconds, they existed in a space between comprehension and belief, the way a crack appears in glass before the entire pane falls. Her daughter was a licensed pharmacist, Castillo continued. She administered her mother's medication daily, following a regimen that her husband told her the family physician had recommended. The physician later said he had never authorized the changes. But by then Mrs. Brecker had been cremated, and the insurance had paid out. How much? I asked. $420,000. I looked out the window at the bay. The water was gray and flat under a heavy sky. A single freighter sat motionless on the horizon, as though it had been painted there. The daughter, I said. What happened to her? She divorced him 14 months later. She moved to Petoskey. She does not know, to this day, what her husband did. The case was never prosecuted. There was no physical evidence remaining after the cremation, and the physician refused to cooperate. And Victor, he relocated to Traverse City. He remarried. Your daughter. Castillo closed the folder and placed both hands flat on the table. The same gesture I had made 1,000 times on the bench when I needed a courtroom to understand that what came next was not negotiable. Mr. Gallagher, what you have brought me is more evidence than we ever had in the Brecker case. The surveillance footage alone changes everything. But I need you to understand something clearly. If Victor suspects that you know, if he perceives any change in your behavior, he will accelerate. He will destroy evidence. He may alter your medication further, and your daughter, who does not know what she is doing, will carry out whatever he tells her, because she loves him and she trusts him. What do you need from me? Time, she said. 48 hours. I need a warrant for Victor's financial records, a subpoena for Patrice Dunlap's phone, and a forensic team to examine the medication currently in your home. I need you to go back to that house and behave as though nothing has changed. Take the pills Nora gives you. Put them under your tongue and spit them out when you are alone. Eat only what you prepare yourself. And do not, under any circumstances, let Victor know that you have spoken to anyone. I nodded. One more thing, she said. The letter from your wife. The sealed one. Have you opened it? No. Don't. Not yet. When this is over, you will want to read it in a house that belongs to you again. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the windows down despite the cold. The air tasted like pine and frozen water, and something I had not felt in 9 months. It tasted like certainty. I pulled into the driveway at 11:14 and sat for a moment with the engine off. The house looked the same. The shutters Dorothy had painted sage green in the summer of 2019. The mailbox with the slightly crooked flag. The birch tree she had planted when Nora turned 10, now taller than the roofline and bare in the December wind. Everything unchanged. Everything a lie, wearing the clothes of ordinary life. I walked inside and hung my coat on the hook by the door. The second hook. The one I had always used. Victor's black wool coat occupied the first. Nora's tan parka hung on the third. Dorothy's hook, the fourth, was empty. It had been empty for 9 months, but I noticed it now the way you notice a missing tooth, not because anything has changed, but because you have finally stopped pretending it does not matter. Nora was in the kitchen slicing bread for lunch. She looked up and smiled, and the smile was so much like Dorothy's that I had to grip the back of a chair. "Dad, you were gone a while. Everything okay?" "Library," I said. Returned some books Dorothy had checked out. They were overdue by about 7 months. She laughed softly. "That sounds like Mom." I sat down. She placed a sandwich in front of me, turkey, mustard, lettuce on wheat bread, and a glass of water with the 2 capsules beside it on a small ceramic plate. The plate had a blue rim. Dorothy bought it at a craft fair in Sutton's Bay in 2017. I remembered because she haggled the price down by $3 and was proud of it for the rest of the afternoon. I looked at the capsules. Off-white. Slightly elongated. The same ones I had noticed 2 days ago. The ones that were not what the label said they were. Nora watched me the way she always did when it was time for my medication, with the attentive patience of a pharmacist who believed in the science of what she dispensed. She had no reason to doubt it. Victor had told her Dr. Whitfield adjusted the formula. She filled the prescription herself at the pharmacy. She counted the dosage herself. Every morning and every evening, my daughter handed me poison and believed she was handing me life. I placed both capsules on my tongue, took a long drink of water, and swallowed visibly. Then I turned to cough into my hand and pushed both capsules into the gap between my lower gum and cheek. When Nora turned to rinse her hands at the sink, I transferred them into my shirt pocket. "Good?" she asked. "Good," I said. That afternoon I established a routine. I sat in Dorothy's chair by the living room window and read a novel I had no intention of finishing. I let my eyes close for intervals long enough that anyone watching would believe I was dozing. When Victor passed through the room at 1:30, I kept my breathing slow and even. He paused near the bookshelf, and I heard the faint sound of his phone camera, a single click, almost inaudible, the kind of sound you learn to recognize only when you are listening for it. He was documenting my decline. At 3 o'clock, Patrice arrived for her afternoon shift. She checked my blood pressure, noted it in her logbook, and asked if I had eaten. I told her about the sandwich. She asked about my mood. I said I felt tired, which was not a lie, only an incomplete truth. She wrote something in the logbook and left the room, and I heard her footsteps move toward the staircase and stop. The same pause I had noticed before. 5 seconds of silence. Then the footsteps continued upward. I called Clem at 4:15 from the bathroom, with the faucet running. He answered on the second ring. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I need you to do something for me," I said. "If anything happens to me in the next 2 days, there is a USB drive taped inside the ceramic pot on the 3rd shelf of the stable. Take it to Martin Crane on Front Street. His number is on the card inside the pot." There was a pause. Then Clem said, "Nothing is going to happen to you, Ed." "Probably not." But Dorothy probably thought the same thing. He was quiet for a long time. "I will check on you tomorrow. If you do not answer the phone by 9 in the morning, I am driving over." "Bring Hank," I said. I always bring Hank. That evening was the hardest performance of my life. Dinner was roasted chicken that Nora prepared with rosemary and lemon, a recipe Dorothy taught her when she was 19. Victor opened a bottle of wine and poured 3 glasses. I drank water. He did not comment on it. Nora talked about a shipment delay at the pharmacy. Victor talked about a property listing he had seen near Elk Rapids. I nodded and chewed, and said the chicken was excellent, and felt the 2 evening capsules in my pocket like small, hard accusations. After dinner, I washed the dishes. It was the first time I had done so in months. and Nora noticed. "Dad, leave those. I will get them." "I want to," I said. And I did. I wanted my hands in warm water. I wanted to hold the plates Dorothy had chosen, and feel the heft of them, and know that this kitchen, this house, this life she had built with me was not yet lost. Victor watched me from the doorway. He held his wine glass by the stem and swirled it once, and in the dim light of the kitchen his expression was the same one I had seen 1,000 times in my courtroom, the expression of a man calculating whether the jury believed him. I dried the last plate and placed it in the cabinet and said goodnight. In my bedroom I locked the door, removed the 4 capsules from my pocket, wrapped them in a tissue, and placed them inside the hollowed-out copy of Michigan Civil Procedure that sat on my nightstand. Dorothy gave me that book as a joke when I retired. I never thought it would hold evidence. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. Somewhere below me, Victor's office light clicked off. Somewhere beyond the walls, the lake moved against the shore in the patient rhythm it had kept for 10,000 years. 29 hours remained. I woke at 5:11 to the sound of wind pressing against the bedroom window. The lake was audible from here on quiet mornings, a low, repeating hush that Dorothy used to say sounded like the earth breathing. I lay still and listened to it, and tried to remember the last time I had woken without fear. It was before March. It was before the pills and the trembling hands and the slow erasure of everything I thought I understood about the people who lived under my roof. 17 hours remained. I dressed in the dark. Khaki trousers, a flannel shirt Dorothy bought me 3 Christmases ago, wool socks. I did not turn on the lamp. I had learned in 2 days that darkness was safer than light in this house, because light invited observation, and observation invited questions, and questions invited lies that I could no longer afford to believe. Downstairs the kitchen was empty. The coffee maker was set to begin at 6:30, a timer Nora programmed every night before bed. I did not wait for it. I boiled water in the kettle and made tea, using a bag I unwrapped myself from its sealed packet. I poured the water myself. I drank standing up with my back against the counter and my eyes on both doorways. At 6:20 I walked to the stable. The air outside was 15 degrees, and the snow from the storm had settled into a firm crust that cracked under each step. The birch tree stood white against a white sky, its branches like the fingers of an open hand. I crossed the yard in 40 seconds and opened the stable door with the key I kept on a nail behind the drain pipe. A hiding place Dorothy and I had shared for 20 years and never told anyone. Inside, the stable smelled of old wood and machine oil and cold earth. Dorothy's workbench ran along the far wall, her tools still hanging on their pegs in the order she preferred: chisels arranged by width, 3 hand planes from left to right, the coping saw she inherited from her father. I had not touched them since March. I could not. To move them would be to admit that the hands that last held them were gone. I checked the ceramic pot on the 3rd shelf. The USB drive was still there, taped to the inside wall exactly as I had placed it. Beside it, Crane's business card. I added one more item: the tissue containing the 4 capsules I had pretended to swallow. I sealed the pot's lid with a strip of electrical tape and returned it to the shelf. Then I sat on Dorothy's stool and opened the manila folder Castillo had given me. Inside was a single typed page: the operational summary. At approximately 5 o'clock this evening, a forensic team from the Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Department would arrive at the house with a search warrant covering all medications, financial documents, electronic devices, and the office currently occupied by Victor Hale. A second team would simultaneously execute a warrant at Patrice Dunlap's apartment on Garfield Road. Castillo herself would be present at the house. She asked that I ensure all occupants were home by 4:30 and that no documents were removed or destroyed before the team's arrival. I read the page twice, folded it, and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket beside Dorothy's sealed letter. 2 envelopes now. One from the law, one from my wife, both waiting to be opened at the right moment. I returned to the house at 6:50. The coffee maker had finished its cycle. Victor was in the kitchen. He stood by the counter in a gray sweater and dark trousers, pouring coffee into the mug he always used, the tall black one with no design, no history, no memory attached to it. He looked at me and raised the mug slightly. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." Walked around the yard. "In this cold?" Dorothy always said cold air was good for thinking. He studied me for a moment. His eyes moved from my face to my jacket to my boots, which still had snow on them. He was measuring something. He was always measuring something. "You should let Nora check your blood pressure this morning," he said. "You have been looking pale." "I feel fine, Ed." He set the mug down. "I am saying this because I care about you. You are not fine. You have not been fine for months. Nora and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider a more structured care arrangement, somewhere with full-time medical supervision." There it was. The next step in the sequence. First the medication, then the confusion, then the documented decline, then the facility, then the power of attorney, then the house, the accounts, the insurance, everything Dorothy and I had built in 43 years transferred, liquidated, consumed. And I would sit in a room somewhere with beige walls and a television I did not ask for and wonder what had happened to my life. "We can talk about it after the holidays," I said. He picked up his mug again. "Of course. No rush." I poured myself coffee from the pot because he was watching, and refusing it would have been a signal. I held the mug with both hands the way a tired old man would. I let my fingers tremble slightly. Not enough to spill, just enough to confirm what he wanted to see. He nodded almost imperceptibly and left the room. At 8:45, Clem called. I answered in the bathroom. "How are you?" he said. "Still here. Hank has been pacing since dawn." "He knows something." "Dogs usually do," I said. "Thank you, Clem, for everything. You do not need to thank me. You opened your door on the worst night of the year. That is not a small thing." I hung up and looked at myself in the mirror. The man looking back was 72 years old, with thin white hair and lines around his eyes that had deepened since March. He looked tired. He looked pale. He looked exactly like what Victor wanted him to be. But behind the eyes there was something Victor had not accounted for. 9 hours. The hours moved the way hours move when you know what is coming, not slowly, not quickly, but with a weight that presses against the inside of your chest like a hand holding you in place. At noon, Nora made soup. Butternut squash, the same recipe Dorothy perfected over 15 years of adjusting the ratio of nutmeg to brown sugar. Nora had learned it by standing beside her mother in this kitchen, writing nothing down because Dorothy believed recipes lived in the hands, not on paper. I ate 2 bowls. I made sure to eat only from the pot on the stove, serving myself, and I watched Nora's face while she talked about a customer at the pharmacy who had argued about a copay for 11 minutes. She was beautiful in the way Dorothy had been beautiful, not from angles or symmetry, but from the way her attention gathered when she spoke to someone, as though that person was the only event occurring in the world. Victor did not deserve her. That was not a judgment. It was a fact. The kind that sits in the record and does not require argument. At 1:15, Patrice arrived. She took my blood pressure, wrote the numbers in her logbook, and asked me how I had slept. I told her I slept well. She smiled, and the smile did not reach the skin around her eyes. I had spent 30 years reading faces from the bench: witnesses, defendants, attorneys who believed they could perform sincerity the way they performed everything else. Patrice was not a gifted performer. She was efficient, and efficiency had been enough because no one in this house had been paying attention. Until now. At 2 o'clock, Victor left to meet someone he described as a potential client in Elk Rapids. He put on his black coat, checked his phone twice, and told Nora he would be back by 4. I stood at the living room window and watched his car reverse down the driveway and disappear around the bend on Peninsula Drive. I needed him back by 4:30. Castillo's plan required all occupants present. If he did not return, the warrant would still be executed. But the confrontation, the part I needed, the part Dorothy deserved, would be incomplete. At 3 to 10, my phone buzzed. A text from Castillo. On schedule. ETA. 1,700. All units confirmed. Stay calm. I read it and deleted it, and placed the phone face down on the table. At 3:45, I did something I had not done in 9 months. I walked into the living room and sat at the upright piano Dorothy kept against the east wall. It was a 1968 Yamaha she bought at an estate sale the year we married. It had not been tuned since she died. I lifted the cover and placed my fingers on the keys and played the first 8 bars of Clair de Lune, which was the only piece I had ever learned, and which I had learned because Dorothy asked me to in 1984, when we had been married 2 years, and she said she wanted to hear music in this house that came from my hands. I played it badly. My fingers were stiff, and the keys felt unfamiliar, and I missed the F sharp in the 3rd bar. But the sound filled the room, the way sound fills a room that has been silent too long, not as music but as evidence that someone is still alive inside it. Nora appeared in the doorway. She did not speak. She stood there with her arms crossed and her lips pressed together and tears running down her face, and she did not wipe them away. "Mom loved that piece," she said. "I know. Why did you stop playing?" "Because the person I played it for was gone. Because every note was a room she no longer occupied. Because music requires an audience. And grief is not an audience. It is a wall." "I forgot how," I said. Victor's car pulled into the driveway at 4:22. I heard the engine, the door, the crunch of his shoes on the frozen path. He came inside carrying a manila folder and a paper coffee cup and hung his coat on the first hook and said, "The roads are getting worse." 4:30. Everyone was home. Nora in the kitchen. Victor in his office. Patrice upstairs, organizing the linen closet. I sat in Dorothy's chair by the window and watched the road. At 4:51, 3 vehicles appeared on Peninsula Drive. 2 unmarked sedans and a white van with no markings. They moved at moderate speed. No lights, no sirens. They turned into the driveway in sequence, and their headlights swept across the living room wall like the beam of a lighthouse passing over dark water. I stood up. Nora came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "Dad, who is that?" I did not answer. The doorbell rang at 4:56. I opened it. Castillo stood on the porch in a dark jacket, with her badge visible on a lanyard around her neck. Behind her, 4 officers and 2 people carrying aluminum cases. Snow fell in small, precise flakes that landed on their shoulders and did not melt. "Mr. Gallagher," she said. "We are ready." I stepped aside. They entered the house, the way water enters a cracked vessel steadily, without hesitation, filling every space. 2 officers moved toward the staircase. 2 others turned down the hallway toward Victor's office. The forensic team set their cases on the dining table and opened them with practiced efficiency. Victor appeared in the hallway. He looked at Castillo, then at the officers, then at me. His face did not change expression. It simply emptied. The way a glass empties when you turn it over, everything that had been held inside. The performance, the patience, the careful architecture of control, all of it draining away in a single moment of recognition. He understood. "Ed," he said. "Just my name, nothing else." Nora stood behind me. I could feel her presence without turning around. The way you feel weather changing before the sky confirms it. "What is happening?" she said. "Dad, what is happening?" Castillo presented the warrant to Victor. He did not take it. She placed it on the hallway table beside the bowl where we kept our keys, the bowl Dorothy made in a ceramics class in 2009. And I thought, even now, even in this moment, she is part of everything. The next 11 minutes contained more truth than the previous 9 months combined. Castillo's officers moved through the house with the kind of precision that comes from rehearsal. 2 went upstairs. I heard drawers open, the measured thud of objects being placed on surfaces, the click of photographs being taken. The forensic team unpacked their cases on the dining table: glass vials, sealed bags, latex gloves, labels printed with case numbers that had been assigned before any of us woke that morning. Every step had been planned. every variable accounted for. Except one. Nora. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the towel still in her hands, gripping it the way a person grips something when the ground shifts beneath them and there is nothing else to hold. Her eyes moved from the officers to Victor, to me, and back to Victor, searching for the explanation that would restore the world to its previous shape. But the world had already changed. She just did not know it yet. Victor spoke first. He addressed Castillo with the composure of a man who had considered this possibility and prepared for it. "I want to call my attorney," he said. "You are welcome to do so," Castillo replied. "After we have secured the premises. Please remain in the hallway." "On what grounds are you?" "The warrant specifies the grounds, Mr. Hale. I encourage you to read it." He did not read it. He placed both hands in his pockets and leaned against the wall and looked at the floor. And in that posture, I recognized something I had seen many times from the bench, not guilt, not innocence, but the stillness of a man recalculating. Even now, with officers in his office pulling files from the cabinet he kept locked, Victor was running scenarios, measuring exits, weighing which version of himself to present next. An officer emerged from the hallway carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside it were 3 prescription bottles from Victor's office desk, none of them bearing a pharmacy label. Castillo held the bag up to the light and examined the contents without opening it. "Mr. Hale," she said, "can you explain why unlabeled medication is stored in your office?" "Those are supplements. Vitamins. You can verify that with any lab." "We intend to." A second officer came down the stairs holding a laptop and a folder of documents. Behind him, Patrice Dunlap descended with her hands visible at her sides and a uniformed deputy 3 steps behind her. Her face was blank. Not calm. Blank. The expression of someone who had crossed into a territory where performance was no longer useful. Castillo turned to her. "Miss Dunlap, we have a warrant for your phone and any communication devices in your possession. We also have a warrant for your apartment on Garfield Road, which is being executed as we speak." Patrice said nothing. She sat on the bottom stair and folded her hands in her lap and stared at the wall across from her, where Dorothy's framed photograph of the cherry orchard in bloom hung in the same spot it had occupied for 11 years. Nora's voice broke through. "Will someone tell me what is going on?" The towel was on the floor now. Her hands were at her sides, fingers slightly curled, and her face had shifted from confusion to the edge of something much worse. The expression of a person beginning to understand that understanding will be unbearable. Castillo looked at me. The look said, "This is yours to do." I walked to my daughter. I took her hands. They were warm from the kitchen, from the soup she had made, from the life she had been living inside a story that was not true. "Nora," I said, "the medication you have been giving me is not what Dr. Whitfield prescribed. The capsules were altered. They contain a compound that has been slowly damaging my nervous system for months. The same compound was used on your mother." She did not pull her hands away. She did not move at all. She stood perfectly still, and I watched the sentence enter her, the way I have watched verdicts enter courtrooms first. The silence, then the comprehension, then the fracture. "That is not possible," she whispered. "Victor changed the prescription. He told you. Dr. Whitfield authorized it. He did not. Victor supplied the altered capsules through Patrice, and you dispensed them because you trusted him. You did not know, Nora. You did not know." She looked at Victor. He was still leaning against the wall. He did not look back at her. He looked at the floor, and his silence was the loudest sound in the house. "Victor," she said. He did not respond. "Victor, look at me." He raised his eyes. And in that moment, whatever architecture he had built between himself and consequence collapsed. He did not speak. He did not deny. He simply looked at his wife with the expression of a man who had always known this moment existed somewhere ahead of him on the road and had chosen to drive toward it anyway. "Elaine Brecker," Castillo said quietly. "Cadillac, Michigan. 3 years ago. Same method. Same family structure. Same outcome. Nora released my hands. She took one step backward, then another, until her shoulders touched the kitchen door frame. She slid down it slowly until she was sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, and she made a sound I had never heard from her in 41 years. Not a scream, not a cry, but a low, continuous note that came from somewhere beneath language, beneath thought. From the place where a person stores the things they believed were permanent. I knelt beside her. The floor was cold. My knees protested. I did not care. You did not know. I said again. Dorothy knew. She wrote it in a letter. She said to tell you it was not your fault. Those were her words, Nora. It was not your fault. An officer placed handcuffs on Victor Hale at 5:14 in the evening on the 4th day of December in the hallway of a house on Peninsula Drive in Traverse City, Michigan, 6 feet from the hook where his coat hung, and 9 feet from the hook where my wife's coat would never hang again. Patrice Dunlap was placed in a separate vehicle. Neither of them spoke as they were led outside. The house was quiet, in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the silence of absence which I had known since March, and not the silence of secrecy which I now understood had lived inside these walls for much longer than I realized. This was a different silence. It was the silence that follows a storm when the wind stops, and the trees are still, and the world holds its breath before deciding what to become next. Nora did not move from the kitchen floor for a long time. I sat beside her. I did not speak. I did not offer explanations or assurances or the kind of words people offer when they believe language can repair what language cannot touch. I simply sat with my daughter on the cold tile floor of the kitchen where her mother had taught her to make butternut squash soup and roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, and I let the silence hold both of us until she was ready to let it go. At some point she placed her head against my shoulder. Her breathing slowed. The trembling in her hands stopped. And she said, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, I gave her those pills every single day. You gave her what you believed was medicine. I said, that is not the same thing. It is exactly the same thing. No, it is not. And your mother knew the difference. She wrote it down so that you would know it too. Castillo's team finished at 7:40 that evening. They carried 11 evidence bags, 2 laptops, Victor's locked filing cabinet, the contents of Patrice's medical logbook, and the ceramic pot from the stable containing the USB drive and the 4 capsules I had saved. Castillo stood on the porch before leaving and handed me her card with a direct number written on the back. The toxicology results will take 10 to 14 days, she said. The financial forensics longer. But what we have is sufficient. He will not be released. And Patrice, she has already begun cooperating. She confirmed the arrangement. Victor supplied the altered compounds, she managed the delivery schedule, and your daughter administered them without knowledge. Miss Dunlap's phone records show communication with Victor dating back 19 months. Before your wife died. I nodded. 19 months. He had been planning this before Dorothy's first symptom, before the trembling hands and the clouded thoughts, and the morning she looked at me across this kitchen table and said a word I did not understand. I understood it now. She had not said careful. She had said Carol. The name Patrice Dunlap used before she changed it. The name she carried in Cadillac when she helped Victor do this to Elaine Brecker. Dorothy had been trying to tell me who the woman in our house really was. I stood on the porch and watched the last vehicle disappear down Peninsula Drive. The snow had stopped. The sky was clearing from the west, and a thin line of pale gold light sat on the horizon above the lake. The kind of light that appears in December only when the clouds break at exactly the right angle, as though the sky is offering a single moment of clarity before closing again. I went inside and fixed the kitchen light. It took 4 minutes. The bulb had not burned out. The connection was loose. I tightened it with a quarter turn, and the light came on, filling the room with the warm yellow glow that had been missing for 5 weeks. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary repair. But standing in that kitchen with the light on and the counter wiped clean, and Dorothy's cherry blossom mug sitting on the shelf where it had always sat, I felt something shift inside me that I cannot adequately name. It was not happiness. It was not peace. It was the sensation of returning to a place you never actually left, but could not find in the dark. Nora was upstairs. I heard the shower running, and then silence, and then the sound of a door closing softly. She would need time. She would need more time than I could measure, and more grace than I could give, and there would be nights ahead when she would lie in the dark and count the pills she had placed on her mother's tongue and wonder if forgiveness was something she deserved. I would be there for those nights. Every one of them. For as long as I had. At 9 o'clock, I sat in Dorothy's chair by the window. The lake was invisible in the darkness, but I could hear it, that low, repeating hush she loved. The sound, she said, was the earth breathing. I reached into my jacket and removed the ivory envelope Martin Crane had given me. Dorothy's handwriting on the front. Ed. When it is over. I opened it. Inside was a single page, written in the blue ink she always used, the letters careful and steady, the handwriting of a woman who knew she was running out of time and wanted every word to stand. My dear Ed, if you are reading this, then you found the truth, and I am sorry I could not stay long enough to tell you myself. Please, do not spend your remaining years in anger. The house is yours. The orchard is yours. The life we built does not belong to the people who tried to take it. It belongs to us. Fix the kitchen light. I know you have been avoiding it. Play the piano, even badly. And take care of Nora. She carries more of me than she knows, and none of what happened was her hand. It was always his. I loved you for 43 years, and the only regret I have is that I did not get 44. Be well. Be stubborn. Be the man who opens the door when the storm comes. All my love, Dorothy. I folded the letter and held it against my chest and sat in her chair and listened to the lake. The next morning, Clem arrived at 8 with Hank. The dog walked through the front door, past the hallway, past the empty hooks, and went straight to the kitchen where I was sitting with coffee and toast. He lay down beside the green-rimmed ceramic bowl that had belonged to a collie named Birch, who died before any of this began, and he rested his broad golden head on his paws and closed his eyes. Clem sat across from me. He looked at the kitchen light, now on, and then at me. You fixed it, he said. I did. He nodded. Outside, the December sun broke through the clouds over Grand Traverse Bay, and for the first time in 9 months, light poured through every window of the house on Peninsula Drive, filling each room without asking permission, the way it always had, the way Dorothy always said it would, if you simply left the curtains open.